Remembrance Day, November the 11th, marks the end of the fighting in the First World War. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent on the Western Front. Today, across Britain, France and Belgium, solemn ceremonies will be held as people remember the terrible slaughter of the Great War, now more than a century past. People's emotions at the end of the war were very different from their emotions that they had at the beginning. In 1914, the prospect of war was somewhat exciting, like anticipating a sporting grand final. Australians particularly had no real idea of the horrors of modern warfare. Australian young men saw the outbreak of war as the opportunity for adventure, for overseas travel, for pride in uniform, for freedom from the constraints of home. Some, no doubt, were motivated by the freedom to gamble, to get drunk and behave badly. And the pay of 5 shillings a day in Australia and 6 shillings a day overseas was very generous, much better than the pay of most unskilled workers of the day. The Aussie diggers saw themselves as just the ones to set the world right. The Australian public also had quite a romantic view of war. War was opera on a grand scale, colourful parades, courageous warriors, stirring speeches and national glory. Much like today, when we enthusiastically send our teams to the Olympic Games, the Australian Imperial Force in the First World War was Team Australia, heading off overseas to bring back medals, national pride and glory. The most popular song in Australia in the early war years was "Australia Will Be There."
All the acquaintance be forgot. No, 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 no. Australia will be there. Australia will be there.
War enthusiasts in Auburn erected in 1916 this temporary honour roll in South Parade to encourage recruiting and to support the war effort. As men who lived in Auburn or who worked in Auburn enlisted, their names were put onto this board for all to see. By 1918, the board had over 800 names. The names were carried over onto a more permanent honour roll that was originally erected in the old Auburn Town Hall. The recruiting committee was very proud to have the names of 900 men and 2 nurses inscribed on the board. In the second half of the war, the mood in Australia was very different. Gone was all the boyish enthusiasm and all the glory of war. The harsh reality of the situation started to sink in. Recruitment dried up as the death toll rose dramatically. By the end of the war, some 60,000 Australians were dead, the resting place of all but one overseas. I frequently quote the statistics that the average death toll was 40 Australians killed every day for the entire 4 years of the war. Then there were the thousands more wounded, disfigured, blinded, gassed and traumatised, many condemned to a lifetime of suffering. In 1918, the mother of Private Edward Maguire of Auburn, who had been killed earlier that year in France, wrote to the military authorities, "Many thanks for your sincere kindness for the photos of my dearly loved son's grave. My other son returned with his left leg amputated, with the left arm partly blown away, and my husband was suffering from the effects of gas. So you see, I have my share of trouble." By 1918, Australia was a broken nation, bitterly divided, massively in debt, a damaged economy, disrupted trade, a nation paralysed with grief. This is what we ought to remember on Remembrance Day. Our forebears rushed off to war without counting the cost. They were full of bravado, eager to join a global event, eager to prove themselves to all the world. All very noble, but naive and reckless. Communities all over Australia built war memorials such as these. We have the one at Auburn, a grand monument in a revered place in Memorial Park. Many communities went in for a statue of a soldier on top of a column, such as one shown here. Others went for a stone column, and the one at Strathfield shows us a globe on the top of the memorial. And we Australians went further than any other nation involved in the war. We built massive shrines of remembrance, both in Sydney and in Melbourne. Whenever we look at these monuments and buildings, we should remember the terrible calamity of the First World War and remember to be wiser and more cautious in our dealings with the rest of the world, lest we forget.